Hey everybody, welcome to the video. My name is Dimitri, and anybody who is a fan of Final Fantasy and the series that every human being, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, Jewish, Chinese, Japanese, Puerto Rican, Vietnamese, or if you're just a crystal hunter. You like that? A crystal hunter? Yeah. The funny thing is that I don't know what I'm talking about. I've only been playing Final Fantasy for the past 15 to 20 years. I started on Final Fantasy X and I worked my way back, and then I worked my way forward to where we are today, which I'm currently working on Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise. So this video in particular today, you guessed it, is the opinion-based video on Final Fantasy. So if you would like to know a little bit more about Final Fantasy, or in particular, the two games that I fell in love with and why I think you should play them, stick around, because this video is chock full of certain nooks and crannies and positive and obviously the best things that you should be interested in if you're looking to play Final Fantasy, or maybe I could hopefully convince you to pick up your first RPG game, which you don't have to play RPG games, but if you're looking for a new genre of games to play, I would definitely look into a Final Fantasy game. That way you don't have to waste your time doing other stuff. Now, just so I can remind you again, even though I am playing Strangers of Paradise Final Fantasy, I am no stranger to the Final Fantasy universe. I do want to let you know that I play Final Fantasy 1 through 15, and I have to reiterate these things because people tend to forget some of the most obvious things when they get wrapped up in some other casualties or anything they might find interesting in the video. But just pay attention to my words, okay? And if you played Final Fantasy for years, so you are obviously aware of the whole aspect of a Final Fantasy game. So I'm a prime candidate if you want a decent opinion on the series. And these two protagonists that I'm discussing are potentially, gonna decide whether you want to actually play the game or not. And if you find your first, Final Fantasy, it can mentally dissect you, and it could possibly change you, your first Final Fantasy, like it did me. Now, just because each Final Fantasy is a different experience, you may feel free to take the information that I give you, and you could take it with a grain of salt, or you could take it to the grave with this experience that I'm going to give you today. Now, if you're aware with the franchise, people are currently playing Final Fantasy more than they eat, sleep, or shower, which is potentially life-changing, and it's a big deal. Some video games are addicting and from time to time consuming, and nevertheless, they're not really particular the easy route to take in life. Like I said before, all games are different. All gamers are different as well. They're very time-consuming games. And people always ask me, why do you play Final Fantasy? Do I look like I play Final Fantasy? So why do I play Final Fantasy? That's an easy question to answer. I don't like a challenge to where I have to quit the game, because that takes the fun out of the game. Now, most Final Fantasy games, they're challenging to the point where you might feel like you want to quit. But fear not, that is the medieval aspect of every genre of RPG game. It's going to take you to a place where you have to actually go back in time and think as if you were a premeditated, primitive beast. But now lately, the Final Fantasies are evolving and turning into a more mechanical, a more electronic, diversitized, advanced feature, which is good. Okay? It's all depending on what you like. But you can't just be your everyday walking cheat code and decide that I'm going to hop on a Final Fantasy game and I'm going to put in every hack I can to beat the game. That's not how it's going to work. But if you're looking for a game that will emotionally detach you from your everyday 9 to 5, your everyday struggle, emotionally take you somewhere where you actually have to think about somebody else besides yourself, then I suggest an RPG game, but in particular, a Final Fantasy game would be a good option for you. But beware, some RPG games are not for everyone. They are an extra time consuming depending on which one you play, of course. Alright, so let's say you're into, I don't know, zombie games. Let's say you're into Resident Evil, Walking Dead shooters, Call of Duty. You can try that. A hack and slash game, a Demon Souls series, possibly, maybe. That's up to you to decide. Or, if you don't want to make that decision, if you want to just open world, explore, you can be more of your independent, driven person. Completely understandable too. Now, I don't know if you as a person are good at these games because it takes an explorative mind as well. So I don't know exactly how you feel about this game, but I would tell you that in particular, you have to have a sense of gratitude for all your surroundings and the world that you explore. Now, if you don't want to have an issue with dying, I would say stick to The Sims. More of a sympathetic game that will guide you through everything. But if you want to take that mixed reality and the human interactions and also the violence, maybe Grand Theft Auto will be there for you, which is also a pretty good game. Grand Theft Auto was the #1 selling game in the world. But hear me out. Like I said, I played video games for pretty much my whole life. When I could, I had to graduate college, school. I had to go out and actually live a little bit. But I always played video games as well. We are going to get more into depth about that later. This is a RPG based video, but we're particularly talking about 2 RPG games. So if you want to comment below and tell me what your favorite RPG game is, that would be helpful. Maybe I can talk about it. Maybe we can all kind of dissect each other's brain a little bit more than what we already have, depending on the game that you wanted to talk about. But ranging from the Pokemon universally, I've played almost every game, like I said, and which is also known as the best-selling game besides Grand Theft Auto. You're also very attracted to the adventure side of life if you play these sort of games, such as myself. But who's more adventurous than me? I don't know, but in a good way, of course. I'm not out here killing people in every RPG game that I play. I actually like to loot a little bit. I like to get my money before I actually go into war. In some of these games, I like to build my craft up a little bit, such as the Final Fantasy Online series. I would not go out and do a quest if I did not have the proper gear in order to succeed in that mission. So there are many steps you can take in every RPG game before you actually do it, because there's certain procedures that you have to overcome before actually jumping into a quest. You can't have a level 1 sword fighting a level 20 villain. It just doesn't add up. Versus some games where it's kind of a roadblock that could be trampled over. Simple. Versus RPG games where you have to do it in a synchronized order. Now, moving on. So if you are definitely not aware, I do have some social media platforms. Check them out. I definitely would. At the recipe underscore TCG on Instagram, the recipe underscore motivate. My name is Dimitri. Okay, Dimitri Marsh, the best to ever do it in the RPG universe. Check me out. But before you start to speculate, check that out. Believe me. All right. So the concept of this video is to dissect my Final Fantasy fans, which is between 7, my favorite out of all Final Fantasies, and Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I actually think introduced a new system to Final Fantasy that we thought could not exist, or to renew and collaborate what we thought would not ever be, I would say, a battle system that would basically fall apart, such as they did in 13, which I don't know too many people who played 13 and enjoyed it as much as they did some of the Final Fantasy games that they have now. See, there are some fans that play Final Fantasy 13, but they're not rated upon like they are versus 10, 7, and even the classics like 9 and 7, 3 and 4, 10, 10 2. But 13 was the first game to kind of introduce the standstill battle system and mix it up a little bit with the freelancing battle system that Final Fantasy VII kind of reintroduced back last year or 2 years ago when it came out. And it was enjoyable. People loved that game. People are still raving about part 2, actually, which I am also raving about as well. So which hero do you prefer? As I give you the bone-chilling differences between the two that can make this video helpful and decide which Final Fantasy is best for you. And oh yeah, I played the original Final Fantasy X, which was on the PlayStation 2, and I originally religiously tried to platinum out a PlayStation 2 game before platinuming a game was even remotely necessary. So just before I could even get a memory card, I was already trying to get every little bit I could out of the Final Fantasy series before the new games came out. During that time of the PlayStation 2 era of the Final Fantasy, that would have been a perfect time for people to join in and kind of get the nostalgic feeling that they will possibly get now from playing a Final Fantasy game in this generation. But for that reason, I could possibly, go back and kind of refurbish some games that you can get into if you were really wanting to dive into some of the new Final Fantasy games, such as the Final Fantasy they have now, which is out, which is called Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise, which I will honestly kind of similar aspects to that game would be probably Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus. Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus is like that piece of cake that you just nibble at. You just keep nibbling at it until you finish it. Like you don't have to finish this cake, but if you do finish this cake, it'll pay off in the end. Okay? That's the type of game Stranger of Paradise is, and that's the type of game Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus was, when they had Vincent who would come and help Cloud when he was in trouble. I don't know if people realize that, but Vincent was a savior to Cloud, but he also had his bad side, such as Cloud. But Cloud's bad side was a mental was a mentally absurd concept that was generated in the Final Fantasy VII series versus Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus, where Vincent would honestly rage out and have another form take over his body. But back to Final Fantasy X. Even now and then, I would find myself popping in Final Fantasy X into my PlayStation 2 hard drive in order just to relive the fact that I had to honestly wield the Brotherhood sword and protect what is known as the physical being of myself before I ultimately gathered myself away into my father's thoughts and process, because he was the whole antagonist in the game. So neither or, being a character in Final Fantasy X, it was very sad. To me, it's truly tragic, and you would fade away at the end of Final Fantasy X before you even got a chance to figure out what was going on. They kind of threw it at you at the end, but you would have to kind of think about what was going on throughout the game. And just at the end, just before you realize that, you know, you're not a real person, your soul is snatched away and your physical being is no more, and your girlfriend is just left there wondering what happened, which is absolutely breathtaking. You know, the truly tragic thing though in Final Fantasy is that there's so many different story plots that it's almost addicting to want to figure out what's going to happen next. Then there's a genetically engineered super soldier named Cloud, which was born a regular human being with a family, you know, a father, a mother, everything you would want. Growing up at the age of 14, set out to be a super soldier, but tortured mentally by his past, not being strong enough to defend his mother before being killed at the hands of Sephiroth, a tragic town set afire. And definitely you can see the difference here between the main character in Final Fantasy X, which is known as Tidus, and the Final Fantasy character in 7 Remake known as Cloud, who was the generic super soldier. Played and I beat Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I will say that the final battle versus Sephiroth and Behemoth, plus him in his actual physical form, Sephiroth, proved to be one of the most difficult challenges that I had to face in Final Fantasy in a boss mode. And the gist of Final Fantasy X with Tidus and Yuna, but before that, I would have to say that, you know, partially the games that have different battle mechanics. So depending on your style, it would be easier or harder for you. It's up to you. But between 7 and 10, I would have to say that the part where you might want to pay attention to is that the modes that they have for the video games are seriously considering if you want to play either one of those Final Fantasies, and it's an awesome franchise. Now, if you want to go off on the internet and see the polls that would say that, you know, Cloud was a better character than Tidus. Now, everybody thinks Cloud is better because he's such a cool individual. Everybody loves Cloud. But if you want to kind of dissect that, I can do that for you now. If you have the sense of composure, you actually want to feel something besides vengeance through the entire game of Final Fantasy, X, this is the way to go. Now, the Final Fantasy verdict is, if you are a caregiving person and you want to kind of have a bubbly feeling of life and joy and the meaning of what am I doing as far as traveling with all these friends, what are these feelings I'm getting as I'm traveling throughout the game, each save point that you encounter, and have these sort of things that, you know, cross your mind as you're playing Final Fantasy is, why am I helping this lady? Why am I helping these strangers? Then Final Fantasy X would be the way to go. Now, if you're looking for a vengeance type of game where hack and slash, I got to figure out, at the same time, why Sephiroth, which is the antagonist, is haunting me, then Final Fantasy VII Remake is the way to go. But if you prefer literally being, ripped from your hometown, your father is a sin, and you're being the worst possible thing known to existence, meeting a group of savage, otherworldly companions that you have to earn their trust, and the entire way throughout the game, and you marry, you have to forcefully see your girlfriend marry, your arch rival. Then eventually you become a ghost at the end of Final Fantasy X. Then Final Fantasy X10 would be the best way to go with Titus. Now, on the other hand, if you seek to only become the number one super soldier, and without, taking the soldier oath, defying all the odds, defeating the terrible, terrorist named Sephiroth, and arguably being your brother, as I would think. You find out, you can't really control your thoughts in Final Fantasy VII Remake or the original 7. And I'm not gonna lie, he is a pretty cool guy, but he does have some mental issues. Cloud, yes.